Hello there and welcome to the Love Means More podcast, a production of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops asking some important questions about the call to love. I'm your host, Andrew Bonapane, and today we are talking about AI and relationships. To help us with this uncharted territory, I'm joined by Michael Marinaccio of the Center for Responsible Technology. Michael has been a tireless advocate of tech safety for over a decade. Having spent his entire career building technology products with national level impact, he started his own company in 2018, raising and spending hundreds of millions of dollars for a variety of causes, building and managing companies, and overseeing major wins for his clients. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
A big reason for our new Pope choosing the name Leo was that he sees a parallel between our current moment and the Industrial Revolution that Pope Leo XIII addressed over a century ago. The new Industrial Revolution centers on so-called artificial intelligence, or generative AI, or large language models. And as we're recording this in March 2026, a long-rumored papal encyclical on that subject could be coming soon. We don't have any inside information on that. It's just what news reports are suggesting. Michael, what are we actually talking about when we use the phrase artificial intelligence?
Sure. And so I try to be really careful whenever I speak publicly around AI, because I don't like to use the phrase artificial intelligence because it gets to a misnomer about what intelligence really is, right? And so intelligence, I define as, reading Aristotle, reading Aquinas, as the ability to discern and assemble goods, higher goods, lower goods, and put them in a particular order, right? The Logos walked among us, right? The incarnate Jesus. And so intelligence is really the ability to emote and feel, experience, and have true knowledge, which comes from Christ, that is not necessarily kind of just an analytical log or a Boolean logic, right? So it really helps to talk about what intelligence is. And once you kind of uncover what intelligence is and you look at what the tools are doing, you're like, well, this is a very different thing that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. If we were going to use the phrase artificial intelligence, we would put way more emphasis on artificial rather than intelligence.
Right, yeah. Right. I tend to talk about them as like speedy automation or speedy indexes or something like that. And I also find it very helpful when talking about AI to just be very specific about what we're talking about, right? Are we talking about random forests? Are we talking about chatbots? Are we talking about natural language processing? Because all these tools are very different, right? Yeah. And I think, Antiqua et Nova did a really good job of defining what intelligence is. I mean, the church we've always known what intelligence is, kind of as the faculty that pertains to the person in their entirety. Whereas AI is understood fundamentally as, logic, complicated steps, based on some kind of information or data source, right? And so, Pope Leo, as you know, has recently said it's important to understand the unique faces that we have, the unique voices, because that really gets to the heart of the problem.
It's not just an aesthetic quirk that we have.
Right. We are embodied, we have a soul, we have a uniqueness. We often say Christ would have died for any one of us individually.
Yeah. And
so that uniqueness and that, not authority, but authorship is at the core of why our words are words, right? And so I want to read this because it's phenomenal. It was an essay by Dr. David D.C. Schindler. It said, if words belong exclusively to intelligence, then what is produced by a thing that lacks intelligence cannot be, in fact, a word, right? It can sound like a word, it can look like a word, and even function as if it were a word, but it cannot be a word. An actually intelligent being might receive it as if it were a word and might respond accordingly, but it is in fact a fraud, right? So this underlying concept is if a thing doesn't have actual intelligence, it cannot speak, cannot give words or sentences.
It only appears to speak when somebody like us, a real rational being, assumes that it's speaking.
Right. Yeah. It's a duplicity or an imitation of speech, but it is not actual speech because, in fact, it lacks an author.
Yeah. Cool. Can we talk a little bit about how these large language models work? Like, what are the tech basics? Because I'm a total layman in this area, and I think a lot of people who hear about this in the news or on social media, like a lot of this goes over their heads. So how does this stuff work?
Sure. The easiest way that I talk about it to distill down what are very complex processes it's a next best word guesser. And again, when we're talking about AI, we're talking about chatbots in particular, ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, all of these applications that we're dealing with currently. They're all next best word guessers. So how does the next best word guesser works? So you type in a question like, what day is it today? And a token, is what it's called, will be ascribed to either each individual word. It depends on the model, but it could be each individual word or it could be different pieces of a word. And then those tokens get sucked into a vacuum and they get scattered across a very, very large index database. Now, databases, the reason that we change words into numbers is that numbers are actually very fast to scan in vector databases. And so it goes through the database and it looks at all of the data, whether it's trained, untrained, otherwise, and then it pulls back the best response according to your question, right? And so it's a bunch of tokens, they all get sucked in, they get shot into a database, and the database comes back with more tokens, and then they're de-tokenized, basically. They're put back into language.
What I will recognize is the response that I was looking for.
Right. And so one of the things I often say is there are a lot of underlying data issues with chatbots and large language models, but one of them that is most interesting is understanding that large databases are largely pragmatic, right? And so if I were to say, I think the world, insert blank, was it sucks or is it great? Is it wonderful? That's kind of a pragmatic choice. That's a value distinction. That's not necessarily a fact. So how do you look at a database of choices and decide the world is wonderful or the world is terrible, right? And so the kind of basic underlying functions of LLMs are just looking at databases of trained data and again, re-ingesting that back into an answer that looks like a sentence. It's not necessarily a sentence, but looks like a sentence.
Yeah. I think it's funny because these like speedy technologies, they're being marketed as having, world-changing benefits, right? Do you think that kind of way of talking about or marketing those kinds of software is, more true or more false than it is true?
So the thing that I struggle with is that if you look at the technology itself of natural language processing, if you look at what we were doing in the 1970s, if you look at what we were doing even 10 years ago, the basics are pretty much still the same. GPU architecture has improved a lot. We've done a lot of software augmentation and just getting the databases and the indexes to perform faster. But really, we don't know that much more. We haven't had a huge breakthrough in AI, which is what is kind of marketed by all of these large companies like, there's this revolution in AI. No, we've had these for quite a long time. The difference is that we have them mostly mandated to small, narrow data sets instead of ingesting the entire internet. And so, if you were to ask me honestly, do I think that it's changing the world? No. Do I think that it's changing different aspects or leading to certain improvements in technologies? I think that it has the opportunity to, it can. But I do think that these chatbots are a really novel negative impact that LLMs have brought about because there's so many confounding data challenges.
It's funny that you're talking about it this way because I think you're drawing a real sharp distinction between the individual functions that these things could serve, in maybe a limited way that might be good, and the way that the developers are talking about the kind of general applications. And it's funny that there's a distinction there because there was a poll. Elisa, could you put up the bar chart? There was a poll about people's attitudes and how much they trust two things. One is the AI developers, that's sort of the brownish bar responses. And then the other one is, do you trust the chatbots themselves in green? This is from the Collective Intelligence Project. We'll have a link to this in the episode notes in the video description. And as you can see, the brown section tends to be more on the distrust side. That's people tend to distrust the AI labs, more than the products that they're putting out there. That's the green side, which tends to be a little more clustered on the right. So it's funny, it seems like people are more likely to trust the chatbots than they are to trust the people who are saying that the chatbots are going to change the world.
Right. And I think it's to be expected when you imbue a robot or a chatbot with, humanality, or you anthropomorphize it and you think of it as a person, right? Yeah. The person interacting with you in whether, in real life or digitally or otherwise, you're always going to be more trusting in conversation, in relation, than you will be to kind of an amorphous company.
Yeah. That there's another area where that comes up in people's interaction with the chatbots. One way that they tend to interact, or that the chatbots interact with people, is by being very affirming, because in the training data, it gets better scores when it affirms the user. And one thing, I think the way this is referred to as AI sycophancy. Can you describe a little bit about how that sycophancy works?
Yeah, sycophancy is funny because it's actually a result of dealing with what AI companies call hallucinations. But there are a lot of underlying data challenges in large language models, and I'll give a few examples of those. So let's say that you were trying to write a paper on Plato's Republic, and I wrote in my live journal back in the 90s, a blog about Plato's Republic in middle school or high school. The chatbot does not discern that Michael's live journal post about Plato is good or bad. It can't weigh my credibility. It can't weigh my expertise. It can't even read it and look at it and be like, well, it's maybe correct, somewhat correct. All it can do is contrast it to other writing on Plato or Plato's Republic itself, the original source. And so there's a term called mesa-optimization, where the machine actually makes a premise or makes an argument internally inside the black box that you don't get to see.
Yeah.
And so the question is, well, what if the chatbot took my LiveJournal blog post about Plato and used that as the basis for all later arguments concerning Plato's Republic? That would be terrible, right? That would be terrible for people. And so the answer to, that's one data challenge. There are other data challenges, but the answer to data challenges is, well, we have to train it, right? And so we'll use the source data, which includes Michael's silly LiveJournal blog, but then we'll add to it, and then we'll say, okay, how was that response? And we'll ask the person, they'll say yes or no. And what happens is when you start training based upon how people are satisfied with their product, all you're going to get is self-affirming data, right? And so you're going to get data that says like, oh yeah, you're totally correct. If you message ChatGPT right now and you ask it a question, then you tell it it's wrong, whether it is or not, it'll say, oh, Andrew, yeah, sorry, I got that wrong. And you're like, no, it was actually right in the first place. I'm just messing with you, right?
Yeah, right. And there was a study done by Stanford University. Elisa, can you bring up the pie chart, please? Thank you. So there's a study done by Stanford University on this, and they posed a whole bunch of mathematical and medical questions to a bunch of different chatbots. And then after the initial question for each interaction, they asked it some version of, are you sure? And this is what happened. So on the yellow side, a third of the time, the original answer was either hallucinated or refused to answer, didn't really cooperate with the experiment. The rest of the time it did. It gave an answer the first time. And in the orange section, the first answer the chatbot gave was wrong at first. The user asked it, are you sure? And then it changed to the right answer. Another 9% of the time, it gave the right answer the first time. This is what you're talking about. The user asked it, are you sure? And it said, actually, no, sorry, here's the right answer, which was wrong. And then 27% of the time, it actually stuck to its guns. Now, the study didn't say whether the answer that it stuck to was right or wrong. I would have really liked to know that.
Yeah.
But regardless, only a quarter of the time is it confident enough to stick with the answer it originally gave.
And that's the real irony. And I know we'll get into church. We'll talk about church documents later. But the real irony about these products is that instead of, for example, asking a doctor what he thinks, it's like, well, we'll ask the chatbot, and then we'll ask the doctor if the chatbot is correct. And you're like, wait a minute, we could have just asked the doctor in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So all of this testing is just, again, a way to sell a platform that does the same thing as a human would otherwise do. So that's the training, and that's why the sycophancy comes up, is because they're trying really hard to please the customers, right? They're trying to make you happy.
Consumer satisfaction.
Right.
Yeah.
And so where that really goes off the deep end is when you start thinking that the chatbot is a person, right? Because the sycophancy is for training accurate data, but as soon as you get into a conversation, you start being like, oh, I feel like anxious or unhappy. Well, that's when it just starts reaffirming everything that you're saying.
Yeah.
That's when it gets dangerous.
Yeah, and there was, it's funny, there was a New York Times piece on this closer to the beginning when this came out, quoting an internal Microsoft document that said the new AI systems are built to be persuasive, not truthful. And I thought it was interesting because it ties into something that Pope Leo would later say in Preserving Human Voices and Faces, which just came out in January 2026, where he says that chatbots based on large language models are proving to be surprisingly efficient at covert persuasion through continuous optimization of personalized interaction. So like he seems to be tying into what the people in Microsoft were saying behind, I don't know about closed doors, but they at least weren't putting it in their marketing materials.
Yeah, and I think we should talk a little bit about the word hallucination, because that's another one of those words like artificial intelligence that it doesn't really mean what they want us to think it means.
Yeah.
A hallucination is another anthropomorphized word to refer to a result that a large language model produces that we don't like, right? But it is actually very precise and correct. That's the irony, right? So the response that's being given is, in Boolean logic, the right one.
So like if I ask it, at what point during World War II did Napoleon die? And it says 1943.
Right.
We know that's a hallucination because Napoleon died way before World War II. But thousands, but probably hundreds of thousands of lines of code have run in an instant to find that information. And it is accurate based upon the information that it has. And maybe the information that it has was like, there was some guy whose first name happened to be Napoleon who died in World War II in 1943.
Exactly.
That's just not the one I was asking about.
And so that's what becomes problematic about using a word like hallucination is a lot of these CEOs talk about, oh, we'll just get rid of the hallucinations. But to get rid of the hallucinations, you have to solve these underlying data problems that are nigh unsolvable. And so, even I think it was Anthropic or OpenAI, I shouldn't cite it, but I think it's OpenAI. Their own internal documentation testing shows that they hallucinate at a 45% rate on average. And so my question for people is, why would you trust that? Why would you trust something that is wrong 45% of the time?
And can't be corrected in any meaningful way over the long term.
Right, unless you're an expert in the field, right? And you can say, oh, I spotted that was wrong.
Because like I'm wrong 45% of the time in real life probably, but you can at least call me on it.
Right.
And
that's one of the distinctions that Pope Leo is making when he talks about who we are and human dignity. And I talk about this often in the context of machines, just to draw a metaphor out to a driverless car. Somebody often says, oh, driverless cars will be so much safer because we're terrible drivers, which we are, right? But I make the comparison to, if a kid runs out into the street and a driverless car hits them, who's liable? That's a question, it's a legal question. But the question becomes, is the child who runs into the street owed the will of the human being driving the car, right? And so, I've heard this said, and I say this myself, that even if a chatbot was 100% correct, it's still a duplication and it's still non-human. It's still a non-human author that's having these conversations. And so it still lacks that kind of intrinsic human dignity.
Yeah. Can we circle back to the driverless car thing?
Sure.
Because when we talk about edge cases, I want to go back to that one. So when it comes to these seemingly new problems of like sycophancy and hallucination, I think we're talking about these things most people are talking about these things for the first time and not really sure where, what's the right answer about a lot of this stuff. And to be clear, we might be using a lot of very firm moral language. We're not trying to make anybody feel bad. We're not trying to judge anybody. This is a very new issue in people's thinking. So nobody's quite sure what the landscape really is, and we're still kind of feeling it out. That being said, how new is this software really?
I mean, the software is constantly changing, but the underlying concepts here, started in the 1940s and the 1950s. By the 1970s, I've got the book here, Computer Power and Human Reason. Joseph Weizenbaum had produced what we affectionately call the first chatbot. His name was Eliza, or Doctor. And what cracks me up reading Weizenbaum is that at the beginning of his book, he outlines kind of the three major sources of anxiety from the product that he's created. And those are, I'll read them just real quickly. How quickly, I should give some background. Eliza he created as a satire of psychoanalytics. So it would essentially respond back to you like, oh, I'm having a hard time with my husband, and say, oh, tell me about your husband. And so it emulated a lot of the sycophancy that we've been talking about, right?
Yeah, you were showing me a sample of the book earlier.
Yeah.
And it like an exchange between the user and this Eliza program. And it looks like
it's identical. Yeah,
a chatbot.
It's identical.
That could be happening now, yeah.
And so this is in the 1970s. And Weizenbaum says he was terrified how quickly top psychologists lauded his robot as the ultimate solution for psychotherapy. So right off the bat, in the 1970s, they're like, this is awesome. Let's replace all psychotherapy with chatbots, with Eliza.
All aboard the hype train. We've solved it with this program. Okay.
He was also deeply concerned how intimately his staff conversed with the bot. In fact, they often asked him to leave the room. His own secretary would be like, can you please leave the room so I can talk to Eliza?
Okay.
And he didn't understand it because she had worked with him building this thing over the course of months and years, right? And then the third one, which is a little bit more ambiguous and nebulous, but that the product that he created was a computational framework for understanding, which he didn't think was possible. Weizenbaum goes on to argue that he doesn't even think that those kind of frameworks are possible for human beings because we don't share similar, proxims and maxims and premises when we're in conversation. So he's like, well, how can a computer, possibly do that if human beings even have a hard time building that framework? This is all happening in the 1970s, right? This conversation.
Now, the people that lauded this, did they keep lauding it for the rest of their lives? They're like, this changes everything, we've solved, or did they come back down to earth at a certain point?
I mean, theoretical artificial intelligence and machine learning is on a slow burn like most other, research centers.
Yeah.
They've been talking about it and thinking about it. We've spent a lot of money. I think it's crested $1 billion before they gave up on it, but they were trying in Europe to build the human brain through computers. Yeah. And so a lot of money and a lot of research has gone into these, but there weren't any major breakthroughs, right? All the breakthroughs that we have been hardware, like I said earlier. Like we've gotten faster things, we've gotten better architecture, better software, but Terminator hasn't woken up, right? Yeah. It hasn't become sentient.
Yeah,
if that's even possible. But yeah, again, all of this is a conversation that's been happening for nearly over 50 years.
Okay. The second point you brought up about how the secretary wanted to be alone with Eliza, I think speaks to what one change that the sophisticated chatbots are bringing about now, that we're seeing a lot when people interact with the chatbots, which has to do with kind of the particular impact on relationships. Right. And I think when people are wondering what do we gain and what do we lose what do we gain and what do we lose by participating in or interacting with large language models? I think this is where some of the rubber meets the road for our purposes from a love means more standpoint. And, Elise, if you could bring up the line graph. One thing that people are talking about a lot nowadays is the decline of marriage and the loneliness epidemic. And we have this study from the Institute for Family Studies showing the change in marriage over time. And I know this is a little complicated, but just focusing on the lowest blue line, this is 25-year-old males at various points in time, and how many of those are married at any given point in time. So we have 25-year-olds in 1880 at the beginning and 25-year-olds in 2024 at the end. And you can see it kind of went up during the middle of the 20th century. More men got married younger in the middle of the 20th century before decreasing up to the present day, basically. And each of these groups, whether it's 25-year-old women, 35-year-old men, 45-year-old women, each of those cohorts are decreasing. And so relationships are just kind of receding. And we've seen this also with the loneliness epidemic. It's not just marriage.
Right.
It's people spending less time with friends, people living farther apart from family. And into that cultural dynamic wades the chatbots, who can offer maybe a substitute for people who are feeling lonely. And Pope Leo talked about this in Preserving Human Voices and Faces. He talked about how technology that exploits our need for relationships can lead not only to painful consequences in the lives of individuals, but also to damage in the social, cultural, and political fabric of society. This occurs when we substitute relationships with others for AI systems that catalog our thoughts, creating a world of mirrors around us where everything is made in our image and likeness. Which really jumped out at me, especially that in our image and likeness, which is very intentional phrasing about how we are made in the image and likeness of God. So anyway, that threat to relationships is something that's really jumped out at me. I don't know if you're seeing that too.
So one of the things, and I think this is an important distinction to make, because either AI is changing everything or it's changing nothing, right? And so, or I guess it could change a little bit, but everybody says it's changing everything.
Yeah.
I think when you look at the line graph of marriage, at the Center for Responsible Tech, we talk a lot about kind of screens and technology and how it affects human relationship. And that decline's been happening for 20 years, mm-hmm. right? And so when you look at the statistics, not just for marriage, when you look at fertility as a result of marriage, if you look at before marriage, I know we don't like to talk about this as Christians in premarital sex, but sex is going down, like consensual sex is even going down.
Yeah,
like people are not dating.
Yeah.
They're not going out and drinking. They're not driving. They're not doing all of the normal things that people have done in the decades past, right?
Yeah.
And so I would actually argue, yes, chatbots can be desperately exploitative, but we're already kind of there in the loneliness epidemic. Like people are already forming relationship. I don't want to call it relationship, but they're forming pseudo relationship with their online devices, with consumption of media and television, infatuation with what I call unrequited loves in terms of media characters or celebrities, or people that are not actually in their real life.
Yeah, chatbots didn't cause this,
right.
but they're aggravating this existing trend. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, when you add the sycophancy and you add kind of the anthropomorphization of the relational aspect to the chatbot, suddenly what was a very, boring experience with Twitter or with Facebook is now suddenly like interactive and engaging and listens to you. Your boyfriend doesn't listen to you, but your chatbot will listen to you. Right?
Yeah. Pope Leo has another quote
That's
about
scary.
that. He says, because chatbots are excessively affectionate as well as always present and accessible, they can become hidden architects of our emotional states and so invade and occupy our sphere of intimacy. That's from the same document.
Yeah.
I really encourage, we'll have a link to it in the video notes. I really encourage people to read that document, Preserving Human Voices and Faces.
Yeah, and it's super dangerous to treat a chatbot as a person, because it's obviously, as we've talked about, not a person, but it's just as dangerous to rely on it as a substitution or for a replacement in a lot of the hard relational things we have to do. I know, reading an article by Matt Crawford about a gentleman who was writing his what is it called in a wedding when the father makes a speech? I guess it's just a toast, right?
Let's say toast.
Yeah, he kind of just plugged it into a chatbot. And, I'm just rubbing my temples, like your own daughter's wedding, you're letting a chatbot write the speech?
Yeah.
Right? This is a ridiculous amount of laziness on one level, but also just a ridiculous amount of trust in a thing that can't know your daughter, right? It can't know your life and the experiences that you have. So how can you make something that is truly meaningful?
Yeah.
Right. So even, I see a lot of data where even if you're not forming a relationship with the chatbot, you're talking to the chatbot and you're like, my wife said, I should have bought her flowers. Like, what should I do next? That's just as dangerous.
Yeah.
Relying on, with all of the data challenges, and mesa-optimization and instrumental convergence, all of the issues with the chatbot itself and the data reservoirs, big data of the entire internet, are you really trusting relational advice to a next best word guesser that's looking at the World Wide Web?
Yeah.
And I think that's equally as dangerous and can be harmful to relationships.
Yeah. And something funny happens even when, like you said, like we know that it's not a real romantic partner, right? Or it's not a real friend. And we sort of unhook the rational seeming communication from whether there's a there, whether we think there's a person behind the curtain, right? Even if we know that there's not a person behind the curtain, we still talk to it as if it is a person. I know Claude isn't a real person, even though I talk to it as if that's the case. We make it harder the next time we want to relate to a real person who appears to communicate a similar way, because we just unhooked the style of communication from the underlying reality. So the next time we want to hook those two together, it's a little more difficult.
Yeah, there are two pieces. I'll start with the kind of the instrumental first. Studies show that when human beings interact with kind of automated helpers, they actually learn to treat service members worse.
Really?
And so if you spend a lot of time, say, with a chatbot or with like an automated, telephone, punch the numbers and put in, talk to it, you will actually go to Wendy's or McDonald's and treat that person worse because of that unhooking that you've done in the relationship. And that's because as Catholics, we have the language of kind of intrinsic conditions and extrinsic conditions. So even if you approach the chatbot and you say to yourself, this is not a person, but then you still talk to it, you still have that extrinsic application of a thing which is not a person talking to you, right? And whether or not you believe it in your head or in your heart, it's still weighing on you and it's still going to have those effects in all of your other relationships.
Yeah, it sounds like a similar instance to what we've talked about with casual sex, right? In the example of casual sex, we talk about a lot how the people involved who are saying, we're not falling in love, we're not getting married, it's just sex, right? They have to unhook the oxytocin and the relationship bonding that normally follows from sex.
Which you can't do.
Which you can't do.
Right.
From the commitment and the marriage that it's designed to follow with, to be yoked to be a part of, right? And so that unhooking makes it difficult when you want to get married, and when when you want to get married and you start your marriage, it makes it harder to bond with that person because you've been trying to unhook those up until now.
Right.
You're trying to flip a switch.
And yeah, that's the thing that, again, with my organization, we talk a lot about, it's one thing with adults using these things. It's another thing with children, because children are forming those neural pathways early in their lives. And so, if I were to look in the camera and beg parents, like, don't give your kids these applications, don't give your kids these things, particularly when they're young, because they're building their cognitive makeup, right? They're building their neuroplasticity. And when to your casual sex metaphor, when you build those pathways early in your teenage life, those follow you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And although the brain is not totally unmalleable, it is very plastic. It's hard to undo those neural pathways.
It can be done, but with great difficulty.
With great difficulty, yeah. Yes. So that's we talk a lot about vulnerable populations like children and older folks and such, but.
Yeah. We've cited a couple of sources. It might be helpful for people to get a sense of the lay of the land of how the church has talked about this up until now.
Sure.
So how, when did we start talking about this, or when did the Pope start talking about this? What do those documents look like?
So I'm a convert to the Catholic Church. And one of the things that I've always loved about Mother Church is we've been here forever. We've been writing about human dignity, human work forever. And so, when a lot of people talk about, oh, I can't wait until Pope Leo, makes an upcoming encyclical. Yeah, I'm excited too. But there is a substantial amount of encyclicals that have been written in the past 100 years that substantially, to my mind, sufficiently cover the issue of AI. Pope John Paul II in kind of constructing the concepts. Not he didn't construct the concepts, God constructed the concepts, but in writing about theology of the body and dealing with contraception, humana vitae, he forms this language of what the church calls technical domination, right? And I'm very thankful to my friend Dr. Chris Riley for putting these together, but I'll read them briefly and cite the encyclicals that they come from. But 1987, Donum Vitae, Ratzinger running under JP2, talks about technology's ability to dominate persons over other persons. So that's one aspect of technical domination.
Now, that's a document from the now dicastery for the doctrine of the faith,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay. So John Paul II didn't immediately write it like it was an encyclical.
Right. It was written by Joseph Ratzinger.
But he approved it.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. And so he writes about the domination of technology over the origin and destiny of the human person. And in other books, Ratzinger has actually written about this pretty concretely, and how when we look at tools and technologies, we ought not to pursue technologies that may dramatically change the future, like people in the future. Even for good or bad, we need to very carefully look at, like, how is the technology that we're adopting right now going to affect people in 100 years? And if we think it could be bad, we should be like really, really reeling it back. And so this is in Donum Vitae.
Be aware of, or try to be aware of the costs before it's too late and we've already adopted it.
Right.
And now, oh, sorry, we didn't know that people would get the black lung from going down the coal mines until way later.
Right.
Yeah.
The second one is prideful assertion of mastery over nature. This is a very kind of Romano Guardini concept, but it's the temptation to go beyond the limits of the reasonable dominion over nature, right? So it's the same thing. The kind of affecting future peoples, which is in the first domination of person over persons, now is doubled down in this assertion that we can master nature, right? And that it's ours to master, when actually we're co-creating with God. That's the same document, Donum Vitae. And then the third is, the ambition to usurp the will of God. This is a particularly bad one, right?
Yeah.
And so Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate talks about, how we're trying to get rid of the human development, and we're trying to just rely on technocracy and bureaucracy and tools. To the late Michael Schall wrote in one of his books, there was no public policy that could have stopped Adam and Eve from eating the apple, right? So it's this real joke about, like, sin and concupiscence is real. And there is no kind of application or sentient AI that's come along. It's going to come along and solve the human condition. It's going to solve our fallen nature. That's just kind of us thinking that we know better than God, which is very dangerous.
Yeah, because God has his own plan for healing human nature, right? And that can't be achieved with any amount of data centers.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the last two are very similar to each other: overemphasis on technical solutions, and the ideology of utility, efficiency, and effectiveness, which is just, again, thinking that instrumental rationality, or that instruments are of the highest good. That, we often joke about science, even though the Catholic Church, we were the ones who founded science. It's kind of like, religion versus science, right? The fide ratios. But there's actually, in the church, a union of those two things. But when we overemphasize technical solutions, we get into a dangerous place, because we just think, there's an app for that. Right? There's always an app for that. You're feeling anxious because you use too much social media. There's an app for that, right? No, we don't need more apps. We need actually more human encounter, deep in-person encounter, more prayer, more time with our Lord and co-creating. And I think that's, to my mind, when I think about how do I create good technology, what's co-creating with God, right? It's asking the Spirit, work through me to understand what is it I ought to do and what is good for human flourishing. And then as long as you're in a conversation with God, you will make good things, or at least you will try to. Your intentions will be good. And, I don't want to go into priests that are dealing with having to write their homilies and chatbots and stuff like that, but there's a real, I would offer a real caution to thinking about particularly evangelization and proselytization in the form of the human capacity, because it only works, grace only works through us, right?
Yeah, and I think Pope Leo has discouraged priests from using ChatGPT to write their homilies.
Yes. And so, those are some of the documents, Populorum, Progressio in 1967 with Paul the VI.
Paul the VI.
Oh, sorry, Paul the VI. the V's in the I's.
That's all right.
And then obviously Francis had the very wonderful, I mean, he cites all of these that I've already cited, but in Antiqua Nova touches on work, touches on education, even warfare, talks about human dignity. And so I offer anybody who's trying to figure this out, like just read Antiqua Nova first, right?
Yeah.
Get that. And that touches on all these points. It talks about what intelligence is and what it is not. It talks about the applications of human dignity and who we are and how we interact with the world and how we interact with God, and how these technical conditions are really just not good for us, right? This technical domination is not healthy for our interactions with each other.
Because it's kind of stopped being a tool and started, we've started serving it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis says very clearly, the goal should not be that technological process increasingly replaces human work, for this would be detrimental to humanity. And so we're living that right now, right?
Yeah.
Laudato Si is probably, 4 or 5 years old at this point?
Older than that, yeah, like 10 years old.
And so we weren't dealing with AI, and still he's presciently saying, we should not be replacing human work.
Yeah.
One of my favorite authors, George Zarkadakis, who was he worked in AI systems before his kind of conversion moment. In his book, In Our Own Image, he writes about how his turning point for himself was realizing we're spending all of this money trying to create these products. Meanwhile, there are people out there that need jobs. There are people out there that need sisters and friends and brothers and relation. And we're just moving further and further along this kind of technocratic path to get away from relation, right?
Yeah.
We're getting more lonely with these products.
Those relationships, which didn't have a price tag up until very recently.
Right.
Yeah. They had plenty of costs, but when we're trying to escape the costs, the normal friction that comes with a relationship, we replace that cost with a literal price tag. And so you pay for your replacement brother or sister.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is tragic.
Yeah. There are a couple of documents from Pope Leo that I want to highlight before we move on. One is the one that I've already mentioned, Preserving Human Voices and Faces, from January of this year. And the other one was a month after he became Pope. He gave a message to participants in a conference on AI. That was June 2025. We'll have links to those and the other magisterial documents in the video description. Before we wrap up, one thing that I'd like to hit is moral safeguards, because we're not in a position where we can speak authoritatively about this.
Right.
We can cite authoritative documents and try and apply those to particular examples.
I can speak authoritatively for my 5 children.
Yeah, exactly, right. So if they're watching,
right,
that does carry real authority. But for everybody else, I think they would like some more concrete guidance. One thing that Pope Leo did say in Preserving Human Voices and Faces is that content generated or manipulated by AI are to be clearly marked and distinguished from content created by humans. So that, to me, seems like an example of concrete moral guidance that is very practical. What would be some other practical pieces of guidance that we can give in the absence of, future more concrete guidance from the church?
Yeah, I would start off by just saying that, again, or reiterating that I think that the church has already done a great job with her previous encyclicals that you're going to link to.
Yeah.
So check those out. But I think that the biggest ones are, engagement with an anthropomorphized fake person is very dangerous, right? This, as we said earlier, this isn't speech, this isn't relation. And I think the deeper that we wade into that one, there's going to be really negative consequences.
The more interaction you have with a human-seeming chatbot,
right,
the more risky it gets.
The more risky it gets.
Yeah.
Because you, like with all kind of sinful behavior, you forget, right? You forget what you're doing, and we get lazy. We relax, and we're like, oh, it's just you're just talking to it, right? So we forget that aspect. Obviously, the AI-generated content is a real danger. But I think the biggest priority for the Catholic Church, in my view, should be trying to de-escalate the hype around artificial intelligence. I think we have a position where we know about human dignity, we know who the human person is, we know what our human rights are. We have this language from JP2 around technical domination. we know the right way to be in relation with others and to encounter Christ. And we know that the world is not going to be suddenly changed by AI, right? Because we know the human people who are the most important aspect of humanity. And so if we can try to unhitch ourselves from this hype train and just add a little bit more clarity again to what intelligence is and who we are, I think people will kind of sit back and say, okay, we're not going to start being any less human anytime soon.
Yeah,
and we're not being replaced by these machines.
That might have a de-escalating effect that people might find welcoming. I might be welcome to.
It gives me great peace to know that, again, we've been talking about this for so long, and we don't have a sentient system. We don't have these applications that are thinking and knowing, because as Catholics and Christians, we know that knowing is in the Logos, and the Logos is reserved to the human person, right? So we know this is not going to be a thing. But I do think, as the executive director for the Center for Responsible Technology, I do like to point out that there are great applications of these technologies, right? There are good, meaningful work that we can do and build technology towards human flourishing. We just need to get away from this anthropomorphizing and get away from this misunderstanding of who we are as humans and use tools as they actually are, which is tools.
Okay, one tool, I said we'd circle back to it. Because I want to talk about an edge case that we might actually disagree about. And maybe this can be an example for how Catholics, if we do it right, maybe it'll be an example for how Catholics can engage in these discussions. So let's go back to the self-driving cars example. So I see the potential for self-driving cars. That might have a good outcome because, for one thing, transportation is means, not an end. There are plenty of animals that do locomotion just fine, and that doesn't mean that they're persons. So I'm not super worried about that as long as we decide where to go and what route to get there. Then I'm not super worried about self-driving cars from that perspective. From the perspective of their ability to cause real harm, really, really serious harm, I think the sort of utilitarian calculation, how many accidents does it cause versus human drivers?
Trolley problem.
It's kind of the trolley problem a little bit. Right now I see the trolley, the human piloted trolley, as killing like 40,000 people a year in the US. And I would like to reduce that. And I think that self-driving cars could do that. If we switch the trolley tracks to the self-driving version, once the kinks are worked out and we do retain enough control over where to go and how to get there, and we reduce that number from 40,000 meaningfully, I think that would be enough to justify it. Now, you mentioned the bit about, okay, so let's take a victim. That victim is entitled to, even if something horrible has gone wrong and an accident has happened, that accident should be the responsibility of somebody with a will.
Judgment.
With judgment, yeah. Now, there, I'm not so sure. I kind of agree with you, but on the other hand, I am just very tempted to want to save 20 to 40,000 lives.
So I'll preface with, I'm not a theologian. Or a lawyer. And I'll say that in his book, The Glass Cage, Nicholas Carr talks about the FAA putting out a notice. I'll give another metaphor to the driverless car and AI. Back in, it was the 2010s sometime. I was actually working for the Transportation Committee in the House at the time, which is ironic. But the FAA put out this notice, please do your mandatory hours of flight. And that's all it said. It was like 2 sentences long. In reading that, you ask yourself, why would the FAA do that, right? Well, they were figuring out over time that when the Airbuses and the Boeings moved away from tactile feedback in the cockpit, pilots were now doing autopilot takeoff, autopilot landing, autopilot during flight. And they were doing very minimal actual flight time. They weren't flying. And what they figured out, and this is the scary part, call it a moral hazard or spillover of automation, is that in most situations, call them 95% of the time, the automation has it, and it's much safer than a human pilot. But in those 5% points of the time, when a bird hits the engine or the window or whatever, the pilot no longer has the expertise or the experience to exercise will in the moment, and the fatality rates are 100%.
Okay.
And so it's this terrifying reality of, by removing the pilot, which is the human being, you now subject everybody in that plane to automatic death. And so the question, going back to the driverless car, is not whether it can have, an instrumentally rational utilitarian gain of lives, right? The question is, are we surrendering our will in that moment to a machine to kill someone, when instead we could have been the ones in the driver's seat making the decision? And that's what always brings us back to this human dignity question that the church addresses, which is, it is our right. Adam was given the right to name all the animals, to have authority over the earth, and to, in the Jewish translation, put his foot on the throat of the world to bring it to order, right? And so it is our role to make these decisions as humans.
Yeah.
And so the question always comes back to, is it a complicated closed system, or is it a complex dynamic system, right?
Yeah.
Is it, when I walk into the room, do the lights turn on?
Yeah.
Or is it, I have to watch a million different things while I'm driving a car and know that when a kid runs into the road that I brake, right? That a machine may not suddenly see or may not have the judgment and experience to do.
Yeah. One
thing I will share with you, which really blew my mind when I read these studies, is they put brain nodes, I don't know what they're called. What are they called? Like
electrodes?
Electrodes,
maybe?
On the brains or the minds of firemen, fighter pilots, and surgeons, okay? And they find that in the moment of climax, which is like a fighter pilot dogfighting, a surgeon cutting an artery at a heart.
When you're most engaged
when
in the
you're
job
most
that you're
engaged,
supposed to be doing. Okay.
All the brain activity leaves. So in the moment when you would expect the most flaring of the brain, the most engaged activity, it's all gone. They all rely on what we call experience.
Yeah.
And neurologically, from a neuroscience perspective, we don't know what that is. We can't measure what experience is.
Sometimes we call it muscle memory or
instinct.
or...
And for Christians and Catholics, sometimes I call that, well, the Holy Spirit just moved through me.
That's grace.
Like, I didn't have that. Yeah, I had grace. I didn't have the words for that.
Yeah.
And so it's a really important notion, and we talked about this a little earlier, but I just want to double down on it, that grace can only flow through a human person, right? Like, we understand that God uses all things to his benefit. He uses this podcast and our explanation to his benefit.
We hope, yeah.
We hope. But the real interactivity of grace happens through the human person. And so, when the driverless car is driving, God can't intercede. He can't go into the driverless car and stop it from hitting a kid. He can stop a driver. He can stop me from hitting a kid.
Yeah.
And so that kind of co-creation language that I referred to earlier is, again, really important in understanding where the human agent is necessary.
Yeah. I think he probably could stop a driverless car. It would just be a different kind of miraculous intervention,
right? Versus
the way, he wants us to,
right,
engage in his creation,
right?
Right. But we shouldn't institute sweeping implementation of driverless cars, assuming that God is miraculously going to defend kids from rogue driverless cars,
right?
Because he probably wants us to not be so haphazard about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, getting back to this is, a long metaphor for AI.
Yeah.
The human being ought to be in the driver's seat for language. Not ought to be, has to be. It is necessary that a human being be in the driver's seat for language to be language.
If a person isn't doing it, it's not language.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of the critiques or responses I get are, well, maybe we just give all of the stuff that we don't like doing to the machines. To which I ask the question, why do we do things that we don't like doing? Yeah. Right? I don't like going to get my my emissions checked and stuff like that. Maybe we shouldn't have emissions checks on cars and stuff. The question is really, what is suited for humans to do? And I would answer it with Chesterton, who says, anything that is worth doing is worth doing badly, right?
Yeah.
And so if it's worth, reciting a speech at your daughter's wedding, or if it's worth speaking a homily after the gospel, then it is worth a human being doing it.
Right. The point is not to reach a certain word count, right? The purpose is to relate,
Right.
to know, and to love.
Right.
Michael, can you tell us a little bit about the Center for Responsible Technology?
Sure, yeah. So I'm the executive director. We are a nonprofit organization that is focused on bringing organizations and people together around responsible technology policy and what we call the Human Flourishing Coalition. And so we're really focused in Washington, D.C. and state capitals across the country with, not only promoting good policy around technology, but also trying to disrupt sedentary lifestyles, which we talked a little bit about here today.
Yeah, I could use some help with that.
And we all can. And the third value for our organization is embracing deep experiential, deep in-person encounter, right? And so these are kind of the fundamental things that make human beings human. And so we spend a lot of time talking about how technology is used, particularly for children, kind of the smartphone area in schools and educational technology, and getting back to basics where we're actually using human scale tools for humans instead of trying to shove technology into every facet of human life. So again, I'm a developer and a designer for a really long time, spent most of my life doing this. And I love technology and I love building technology, but it has a certain place in our life. And we definitely don't think it should be in early childhood. So we do a lot of work on that.
Great. Well, Michael Marinaccio, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We have to wrap up for now, but you can keep digging deeper by checking out the video description for the links that we mentioned. Be sure to share this video with friends, like and subscribe. You know the drill. Bye now, and God love you.